Chapter 4. Susan was silent while David and Mrs. Hackenschleimer rounded up the boys and for the trip back to the ranch. She couldn't believe David had deceived her, but really, what had she expected from a stranger? Sure, he was a stranger she enjoyed kissing whom she was now married to, but he was still a stranger. She watched the scenery pass by wondering what to expect from her wedding lunch. She was not looking forward to having to appear happy and hosting a large group of people with the mood she was in. Her wedding day was ruined, and she was in the same situation she'd been in back home, except now she was expected to be the parent. How could she have misread the family so badly? When they pulled up in front of the ranch, David helped Susan down from the buggy and led her into the house. He turned to Mrs. Hackenschleimer. "Will you see to the boys, please? I think I need to spend a minute or two talking to my wife before our guests arrive in 30 minutes. He put his hand under her elbow and led her up the stairs to his bedroom, putting her bag on the bed. She glared at him. "I'm not sleeping in here with you." She honestly couldn't believe he'd expect her to with the way he'd deceived her. What was his problem? His eyes narrowed dangerously. "What do you mean? Do you really think I'm going to sleep with you after you deceived me? I don't want more children who will behave like the ones you've already got." She folded her arms across her chest, letting him know she wasn't backing down. "You're their mother now. Discipline them and turn them into good kids. They were better behaved when their mother was alive." He moved toward her, standing over her and glaring down at her. "And you're sleeping with me. You're my wife." She refused to back up, even though he was doing his best to intimidate her. "You're okay with me disciplining those boys as I see fit?" She poked him in his chest. "And I'm not sleeping with you. I'll sleep in one of the spare bedrooms. I don't believe in hitting children, but short of that, discipline them however you want." He caught her hand and held it behind her back. "And you are sleeping with me. You're my wife and you belong in my bed. If you don't want to consummate the marriage, fine. But you're sleeping in my bed. That's just stupid. Those boys need to be beaten with a switch." She kicked at him. "And there's no reason for me to sleep with you when there are 2 empty rooms right across the hall. What is wrong with you? You think you need to beat my boys and kick me? Violence will get you nowhere in this house." He bent down and crushed his lips to hers, forcing a response from her. When he raised his head, his brown eyes stared into hers. "You will be sleeping with me whether you think it's stupid or not. I won't have Sadie knowing my wife is sleeping in another room." "Fine. You can sleep on the floor." She tore herself from his arms and turned her back to him, pressing her fingers against her lips. Why did she like it so much when he kissed her, even when he was rough about it? "I'll sleep beside you in the bed." He walked up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. "I'm sorry if you feel like I deceived you into marrying me. I haven't been able to find a wife thanks to the boys, and I saw you as my only chance." She turned to face him. "Why didn't you send off for a mail-order bride yourself? A lot of women wouldn't mind being saddled with an instant family." He shrugged. "I was going to, but after Jesse died, the situation seemed too good to pass up." He ran his hands up and down her arms. "I need a wife and my boys need a mother. And you needed to find a job or a husband. You have a husband now." She sighed and shook her head. "Fine, but I'll be your wife in name only. Nothing is going to happen between us that could possibly create a child. I'm already going to have my hands full with the hellions you already have." She wasn't about to mince words with regard to his son's behavior. If he didn't like it, he shouldn't have hidden their true nature from her before they married. He winced when she called the boys hellions, but he knew she was right. They were awful. "That's fine. Just don't shame me by sleeping in another room, please." "I won't." She hated to give in to him, but she could understand a man's pride and need to save face. He glanced at the clock sitting on the dresser. It's time to go down and greet our guests. She shrugged. I guess we need to go then. She looked at him. I hope you realize I'm furious with you. He nodded. I know. And I am sorry. She followed him out of the room and down the stairs to where their guests were already starting to assemble. The boys were all freshly scrubbed and dressed in clean clothes. The clothes weren't as nice as the ones they'd worn to the wedding, but they would have to do. Albert had a fat lip and Louis's eye was starting to swell. She took the boys by the hands and said, "Excuse me," before she was even introduced to any of the guests. She didn't much care if David thought she was rude. She needed to handle her new sons. She took the boys back to the family parlor at the back of the house and glared at them. Do you two really think fighting is appropriate? On my wedding day? Her emphasis on the last two words was meant to fill them with guilt, and by the looks on their faces, it worked. They both shook their heads looking up at her with wide eyes. What do you have to say for yourselves? They both hung their heads, not saying a word. It was obvious they didn't know how she'd react and were doing their best to act contrite. She'd seen the same looks on her brothers' faces over and over. The first part of your punishment for fighting on my wedding day will be holding hands until every guest is gone. That means at the table, while you're playing, and whatever you do, you will hold hands. Do you understand? Albert looked up at her to protest. No way. I'm not going to hold his hand. He poked his brother in the arm to emphasize his words. Susan shook her head and stepped forward to intimidate the boy. You will, and you'll do it with a smile. For every time I see you drop hands during the party, you'll write 20 times during playtime tomorrow, "I love my brother." You can't make me do that. Oh, yes, I can. You will behave, and you will start now. Susan knew that if she let them get away with fighting on her wedding day, they'd always think they could run all over her. It wasn't going to work that way. She was their mother now, whether deception had been used or not, and she would see to their discipline if it killed her. Do you both understand me? The boys nodded, and she watched as they joined hands. Let's go join the others. She made the boys lead the way so she could watch and see if they dropped hands. She walked back to the front of the house and joined David, who was talking to a man and his wife. David saw her slip up beside him and raised an eyebrow at her in question of what she'd done. She simply shrugged and smiled at the woman across from her. Hi. I'm Susan. The woman smiled as she noted the boys holding hands and looking miserable. I'm Beverly Smith. We have the ranch that shares your south border. Beverly was a petite redhead with a pretty smile. It's very nice to meet you. Do you have children? Susan engaged Beverly in conversation, asking her questions about herself and watching the boys out of the corner of her eye. I have 3 girls. They're 6, 4, and 2. Susan noticed the boys drop hands. Excuse me for just a moment, she muttered and strode over to the boys. That's your first 20 sentences each. How long do you think it will take you to reach 100? The boys quickly joined hands again, and she walked back to Beverly and her husband. Sorry. I need to let them know who's in charge. Beverly laughed softly. Those boys have needed someone to let them know who's in charge for a long time. She squeezed Susan's arm. You're going to be very good for them. Susan smiled. Either that or I'll kill us all trying to turn them into well-behaved boys. They can behave. I've seen it. So they will. The look in Susan's eye left Beverly in no doubt that she would have the boys behaving like little gentlemen within a month. I really think I'm going to like you. Would you like to come over for coffee and cookies one afternoon next week? After you've had a chance to settle in? Maybe Wednesday? I'd like that a lot. It'll be nice to have a friend in Texas. Maybe it'll help me not be so homesick. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Susan realized she really was homesick. She missed her parents and Elizabeth a lot. She needed to sit down and write them a letter as she'd promised. Where are you from? I was raised on a small farm outside of Beckham, Massachusetts. It's different here. I was raised in Pennsylvania, so I know what you mean. How long did it take you to get used to the scorching heat? Susan asked as she rubbed her hand along the back of her neck to wipe away the sweat that was pooling there. Beverly shook her head. I don't think you ever get used to it. You learn to bear it, but that's all you can expect of yourself. How did you end up in Texas? My husband was traveling and he came into a restaurant I worked in as a waitress. He sat at my table and I served him lunch. He was lonely and asked if I'd show him around town. When he left town, I left with him as his wife. Susan smiled. I like that story. How long did you know one another before you married? Beverly's story was certainly more romantic than her own. She'd shown up ready to marry and her bridegroom was dead, so she'd settled for his brother. No, there wasn't much romance in her story. 3 weeks. My mother was not happy with me. Susan laughed. Imagine how my mother felt when I said I was moving across the country to marry a total stranger. I'm surprised they let you go. Susan shrugged. I'm the oldest of 12. I've always been very independent, and I think they knew if they tried to stop me, I'd leave anyway. She realized then the men had stopped talking and were listening to them. She looked at David. He took her hand and smiled down at her as if there were nothing wrong between them. Charles, this is my wife, Susan. Susan, my closest friend and our closest neighbor, Charles Smith. It's nice to meet you, Susan replied. She noted that Charles was tall, although not as tall as David. He had blonde hair and blue eyes. He wore a cowboy hat with his suit. She wondered if all men did that here, because David had worn the same thing for their wedding. They both wore cowboy boots as well. Charles nodded at her, his hand slipping around his wife's waist. We'll have to get together sometime soon. Find a night when your nanny can stay with your boys, though. I don't need your wild boys around my sweet girls. I'm really hoping Susan will have a calming influence on the boys, David told him. Susan looked around, realizing she hadn't seen the boys for a minute or two. Finally she spotted them off in the corner with the twins and Mrs. Hackenschleimer. Their hands were still linked, and she smiled. I hope so too. I'm not going to be able to put up with their shenanigans for long. Charles grinned. I can't say David, Jesse and I were any better when we were boys. He looked at David. Do you remember when your mother banned us from ever playing together again? What had we done that time? David's face lit up with a smile. I think that was the time we tied the 2 cats' tails together and then threw a bucket of water on them. He laughed out loud. I'll never forget the sound those cats made. Susan shook her head in disbelief. No wonder the boys were so bad. They took after their father. She saw Sadie waving to her from the dining room and quietly excused herself to go talk to the housekeeper. Lunch is ready. Susan nodded. Thank you, Sadie. I know this is going to seem odd, but for today, will you serve the boys in the kitchen? The 2 oldest have to continue holding hands even while they eat. Sadie's eyes widened and she grinned. I heard they were fighting in the street on your wedding day. That's a fitting punishment. I'd prefer to take a switch to them, but David says he won't allow that, so I'll just have to get clever with my punishments. The narrowing of Susan's eyes left Sadie in no doubt that she was up for the task. Sadie rolled her eyes. I think the boys need a switch, but David feels like it's cruel. His mother never used one, so he doesn't think they're good for boys. His boys would be much better behaved if he used one, though. Susan smiled, thrilled to have an ally. Would you let me know if they stop holding hands? I have a backup punishment in case they do. I'll let Mrs. Hackenschleimer know to watch for that. I'll be serving lunch. That's fine. Thank you, Sadie. Why don't you start loading the table and I'll call everyone to eat when I see it's mostly full. Susan had never had a servant before, so it seemed strange to her to ask the older woman to do things for her, but Sadie made it easy to work with her. That sounds good. We're not doing anything formal, just steak and baked potatoes served with butter. I made some beans and a wedding cake as well. It sounds delicious. I'll send the boys to the kitchen now. She walked to the corner where the boys were sitting with Mrs. Hackenschleimer. Her eyes drifted deliberately to the older boys' joined hands, before she asked Mrs. Hackenschleimer to eat with the boys in the kitchen. I won't always have the boys eat in the kitchen, but until I've had some time to teach them how they're now expected to behave, I'd rather keep them out of the way of humans. I'd be happy to. Mrs. Hackenschleimer stood and took the twins by the hands to lead them from the room. The older boys followed automatically. Once the 4 boys were out of the room, she announced that lunch would be served in a few minutes, before rejoining David. Another couple had joined their circle and she was introduced to Anthony and Jane Vandergriff. Jane had dark hair and pale blue eyes. She wore an ice blue silk dress that matched her eyes perfectly, and seemed to think everyone in the room was beneath her. Susan didn't bother to try to strike up a conversation as she had with Beverly. David guided Susan to the foot of the table and pulled her chair out for her. She smiled as Beverly took the seat next to her. David sat at the head of the table directly opposite her, which thrilled her. She wouldn't have to make much conversation with him that way, and she found she was still seething over his deception. Susan barely picked at her meal, eating no more than a few bites. The food was delicious, but she simply didn't have an appetite. The 4 couples David had invited for the meal obviously knew one another well, and they all talked and joked while they ate. Susan spent most of her time observing them. She already knew she liked Beverly, but Jane was someone she had no desire to get to know. One of the other women seemed to snub Beverly and only talk to Jane. Susan had yet to meet her, but she had dark hair and brown eyes. Susan made a mental note to avoid her. The last woman of the group sat to Susan's left, and seemed very quiet. She was in the same age group as all the others, around her mid-20s, but she was plump and plain. Her mousy brown hair seemed to be forever falling from her bun and her eyes were brown. Susan smiled at her. I'm Susan. The woman seemed surprised to be singled out. I'm Wilma. It's nice to meet you. Which of these men are you married to? Wilma pointed out the man Susan had seen her with earlier. He was a tall blonde with startling good looks. Do you have any children? Wilma shook her head. Not yet. We've only been married a few months, though. How did you meet your husband? Susan had always loved to hear stories of how couples met and married. Each story had filled her with a sense of hope for herself when she was single, and now it was a habit to ask. I've known him all my life. My father and his father were best friends. I think I've always known that I'd end up married to Ned. He's been off fighting the Indians in New Mexico with the cavalry, but as soon as he came home, he started courting me. We'll have to get together sometime so you can tell me more about it, Susan encouraged. I'd like that. Beverly smiled. You should join Susan on Wednesday and come to my house for coffee around 2. Wilma looked at Beverly with a surprised look. I'd love to. Thank you. By the time the guests had left for the day, Susan was exhausted, but thrilled she'd made 2 new friends. She was finding the Texas women to be easy to get to know. Her mind drifted to Jane and the other woman she hadn't bothered to get to know. After they'd all gone, she looked at the 2 older boys. How many times did you drop hands? And remember. I was watching. Albert and Louis exchanged looks. Finally, Albert said, just twice. She'd only seen it happen once, but was thrilled they told on themselves. Then you know that before either of you go outside to play tomorrow, you'll be sitting at the table writing 40 sentences for me, right? But I don't know how to spell, Louis whined. I'll write it for you once, and you can copy it. Susan didn't think it would hurt the boys to sit and write 40 sentences before they went outside. David walked up behind her. What's this? Susan turned to him. I told the boys they had to hold hands the entire time the guests were here today. For every time they dropped each other's hands, they have to write 20 sentences about loving their brother for me. Her eyes dared him to argue. David nodded slowly. That sounds like a fitting punishment for fighting. Why were you boys chasing that cat anyway? Susan asked. Not that it mattered to her punishment, but a reason for their behavior would help her understand them better. Louis shrugged. We wanted a cat. Susan sighed. Maybe if you asked your father, he'd get you a kitten. Albert looked at David in surprise. Would you, Pa? David thought it over for a moment. I don't know why not. The cat will be your responsibility, though. You'll feed it and give it water. I will not be taking care of a cat when I have you 4 boys to take care of. Susan's voice was firm, and both boys nodded eagerly. We'll do it, Louis said with excitement. Sadie came into the room then. I've made sandwiches for supper. I didn't think you'd want more after the big lunch. Susan nodded. That sounds lovely. She walked to the table and was surprised when David seated her once again. She'd thought he was only doing that to impress her and their guests. Maybe he really did have manners. The boys all sat down and bowed their heads while David prayed over the food. She watched as the boys wolfed down their meal. Shaking her head, she knew table manners would have to be one of the first things she worked with them on. After dinner, Sadie cleared the table while Susan got the twins ready for bed. She enjoyed the little boys and was happy to change them into their pajamas and tuck them into their little beds. She kissed each boy on the cheek and left their room quietly. The bigger boys were sitting in the family parlor talking to their father. She waited outside the door listening for a moment before going in. We don't want to have to write sentences, Albert complained. I don't care what you want. You'll do what your new mother says, and you'll do it when she says. You've been running wild for too long, and you'll obey her. Do you understand that? Yes, Pa, Louis said. Yes, Pa, but I won't like it. Susan stifled a giggle at Albert's belligerent tone. Susan walked into the room. Go on and get ready for bed, she told the boys. You'll be writing your sentences before you do any playing tomorrow. She sat down on the sofa and folded her hands in her lap. The boys jumped up to go get ready for bed, obviously afraid of another punishment coming their way. Thanks for backing me up. David nodded. I do know they're monsters. I just don't know what to do about it, short of beating them, which I'm not going to do. Well, I honestly wish you'd let me use a switch on them, but since you won't, I'll find another way to get them to behave. I'm not going to have our lives in constant chaos just because those boys don't feel like behaving. They obviously know how. Now it's just a matter of enforcing some ground rules. David eyed her doubtfully. If you say so. He stood up, stretching his neck. Would you like to go for a short walk before bed? She looked at him skeptically, but then nodded. That sounds nice. She did want to see the ranch. The few times she'd been outside had been brief. She enjoyed being outdoors, and wanted to know what was out there. He walked her around the yard, pointing out the different buildings and explaining their functions. The ranch hands live there. No women are allowed in there under any circumstances. She nodded. Sounds like a good rule. Do you let the boys go in there? He shook his head. Not without me. You'll have to let me know about rules like that. I think I'm going to make up a rule board for the boys and let them know what the punishment is for each thing. That way they know what they're getting into if they break a rule. He took her hand in his. I appreciate you jumping in so quickly to help get the boys under control. She sighed and shook her head. It's my job now. I don't think the twins are going to be a problem. They're still so young, they'll just learn to obey me. The older two are the ones I'm worried about. Don't be worried about them. I don't think there's going to be a problem. You seem to have it all under control. He stopped to lean against a wooden fence at the front of the house, pulling her to him with the hand he held. Would you consider making our marriage a real one? She sighed, staring up at him. I really don't want to bring another child into this situation. I can't imagine having a newborn and dealing with your hellions. She wasn't trying to be cruel with her words, but she needed him to know where she stood. He used his forefinger to tilt her face up to his. Our hellions. Our hellions. She watched as he slowly lowered his head toward hers, brushing her lips gently with a kiss. Her hands moved up to his shoulders and she clung to him, almost afraid she'd fall over. There was something about his kisses that left her weak in the knees. We'll have the boys under control well before a baby comes along, he whispered against her lips. She shook her head, pulling away. My mother was always so sick with morning sickness she neglected the discipline of my younger brothers and sisters. That's why I'm the oldest member of a family whose children are referred to by the city of Beckham, Massachusetts as the demon horde. He stifled a laugh. I promise you, if you get pregnant, I'll follow through on all your rules and discipline the boys exactly how you think they should be disciplined. Without the switch, of course. I won't use a switch. How about a belt? Or paddle? She grinned as she suggested the alternatives that would work just as well. He grinned. No beating. Any other punishment you can devise is fine. Would you build a dungeon? She tilted her head to the side to ask the question. She would never put children in a dungeon, but it was interesting to see just how far he'd go. He laughed out loud. You really don't like children, do you? I love children. Ill-behaved children need to dangle from trees by their toes until they learn the correct behavior. He caught her hand and pulled her back into his arms. Fix my boys for me. He lowered his head to hers, his tongue reaching out to trace her top lip. And go upstairs with me and be my wife. Once again her hands clung to his shoulders. She was his wife, and she knew as his wife, it was her job to let him consummate the marriage. Besides, she liked the idea. She'd enjoyed kissing him and wanted to see what came next. Okay. Chapter 5. His head came up and he looked into her eyes. Really? She nodded slowly, and he started tugging her toward the house as if he didn't want to give her a chance to change her mind. She laughed softly. Are you always in this kind of hurry? He didn't stop as he answered, simply pulling her along toward the front door. It's been over 2 years. You bet I'm in a hurry. He flung the door open and pulled her up the stairs and into their bedroom. He quickly sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots, and then knelt before her, untying her shoes and slipping them off her feet. He rose to his feet and stood before her, trying to force himself to slow down. He had to keep saying over and over in his head that this was her first time, and he couldn't be in such a hurry with her. She stood looking at him by the dim light from the moon drifting in through the window. Her mother had talked to her about the way things happened between a man and his wife before she left, but it hadn't made her any less nervous. Of course, she'd been raised on a farm, so she'd had a pretty good idea of what went into making babies anyway. He shut the bedroom door and took a step toward her. Turn around so I can unfasten the buttons on your dress. She obeyed, turning around and presenting him with her back. I'll need to get my nightgown. No, you won't. There's no need for a nightgown in the summer. It's too hot for that nonsense. He quickly unbuttoned each of her buttons, pressing quick kisses to the back of her neck, and turned her around to face him. He pushed the dress off her shoulders and down to the floor. His fingers went to her hair and plucked out each of the pins that held her hair in place. He ran his fingers through her hair, his eyes widening as he saw the length of it. Once she was standing in just her petticoat, he leaned down and kissed her, his tongue immediately demanding entrance to her mouth. She opened for him and moved her hands to his shoulders while he kissed her. Her hands went to the buttons on his shirt and slipped them out of their holes. She pushed his shirt off his shoulders and down to the floor. She thought she'd be more embarrassed about standing in just her petticoat in front of him, but the relief of the slight breeze coming through the window was almost worth it. She wished she could throw cold water over both of them, but was certain he'd think she was insane. He continued to kiss her as he dropped his hands to the waistband of his slacks and unfastened them before dropping them and his underwear to the floor. He stepped out of his slacks and pulled her to him, his manhood pressing against her petticoat. She was shocked to feel him against her, but knew it was a part of being a wife, so she said nothing. His lips went to her shoulder, and he moved the strap of her petticoat aside to give himself better access to her bare skin. Soon she felt him push the other strap down and he dropped her petticoat to the floor. "You have a beautiful body," he whispered. She blushed. "I'm glad you like it." He pushed her backward until the bed hit the backs of her legs and then toppled her over onto it. She let out a quick laugh. Somehow she'd pictured him picking her up and carrying her to the bed, not pushing her onto it. He followed her down, propping himself on one elbow as his hand moved over her bare breast. "Are you laughing at me?" She shook her head. "At myself more than anything. I just never pictured my bridegroom pushing me onto the bed. I guess I always thought I'd be carried and gently placed there." He grinned. "My way is faster and more fun." His fingers plucked insistently at her nipple. "I think it is." She looked down and watched his fingers playing with her nipple in the dim light of the moon which shone through the open window. It was strange to watch him touching her that way, but oddly, it sent tingles through her, making her much more aware of his strength as opposed to her softness. His lips went to her neck and bit her gently. "That feels nice," she whispered. "Tell me if there's anything you don't like." She laughed. "So far that's just not happening." His hands traced her hips and went straight down to the curls that shielded her innocence. He smiled at her surprised gasp and moved his fingers down between her legs, which were clenched tightly together. "Spread your legs for me, sweetheart." She moved her legs slightly apart and his fingers went immediately to her core, one of them slipping quickly inside her. She hadn't expected him to touch her there with anything but his man part, so she jerked in surprise. "What are you doing?" "Don't worry. You'll like it." His fingers slipped in and out of her slowly at first, but gathering speed. "I want you to be ready to accept me." She swallowed hard, knowing what he was referring to. His fingers did feel good, and they seemed to be pushing her towards some unseen goal that she didn't quite understand. She looked at his face in the darkness and saw an intense look in his eyes, almost as if he was in pain. Her hand reached up to stroke his cheek as his finger played inside her. After a moment David turned his head and brushed a kiss across the palm of her hand. He moved his finger out of her, and before she had a chance to protest, he had slipped it back in with another finger added. She moaned softly with surprise and pleasure. She'd had no idea this part of marriage would feel so good. She'd expected to simply lie back and submit to her husband, but she wanted so much more from him. She felt like she was getting close to something, and started to move her hips with his fingers, thrusting back against them. "That feels so good," she whispered. David took that as his cue and removed his fingers and rolled over so he was resting between her thighs, but catching his weight on his elbows. "This should feel good too then." He dropped his lips to hers and kissed her passionately just as his member pushed against her opening. She was startled to find him on top of her and pressing against her so quickly, and his manhood felt nothing like his fingers had. She'd never seen a fully erect penis and was surprised at the size of the thing pressing against her. She moved her hips a little to give him better access, because she believed him. She'd loved everything he'd done to her so far, and she was looking forward to having him deep inside her. When he felt her move against him, he knew it was time, and pressed deep inside her, breaking her barrier on the way. He held still when she let out a startled cry and stared up at him in the dark. She wiggled her hips trying to get more comfortable, but it wasn't working. It still hurt. It doesn't feel good. Your fingers were much nicer. She knew she should just lie back and submit to him, but it hurt and he'd said it would feel good. Had he lied to her? He groaned as she wriggled beneath him. It was all he could do to hold still while she adjusted to his invasion of her body, but her movements were just adding flames to his already burning libido. Stay still for a minute while the pain passes. I can't. It hurts. She kept moving under him, her hips driving against him and moving from side to side trying to escape the pain. After a moment, he gave in and started to thrust inside her, driving them both toward their pleasure. He wasn't able to hold out as long as he'd hoped, because it had been so long, and it was just moments before he let out a groan and collapsed on top of her. Susan lay beneath him disappointed. After the initial pleasure when he had used his fingers, she'd hoped for more. Toward the end it hadn't hurt as badly, but there had been nothing spectacular at the end like she thought there would be. She sighed heavily, and he opened his eyes looking deep into hers. You didn't enjoy that very much, did you? Not really. Sorry. And she was. She'd hoped to enjoy it. A friend of hers at church had whispered to her all about how much fun being a wife was, and she'd expected a lot more of the experience. He rolled to her side, stroking her cheek. You'll like it more next time. Okay. She said no more, but it was obvious by her tone of voice that she didn't think she would. He rolled to his back and pulled her against him, pillowing her head on his shoulder. I promise. It'll get a lot better. She snuggled into his side, already closing her eyes. She was surprised she was able to get so comfortable with a man in her bed, but she was so tired, she just needed to sleep. It had been an exhausting, emotional day, and she had a battle ahead of her training the boys to act the way she expected. He stared down at her wondering what to say, but realized she'd already fallen asleep. He smiled. His new wife was so much more than he'd expected her to be. Her spirit would keep him on his toes. Chapter 6. The next morning after breakfast, Susan sent the twins off with Mrs. Hackenschleimer and sat down with the two older boys. We need to talk for a few minutes before you start writing your sentences. She'd set some paper and 2 sharpened pencils on the table for them to write with. Both boys looked at her with wary eyes, as if they were expecting to hear something they didn't want to. They were right. We're going to set some rules for the house, and you will follow them. If you don't, there will be consequences. Albert sighed and glared at his brother as if it was his fault they were having this conversation. The first rule, she said, pulling a piece of paper to her so she could write each rule as they discussed them, is no fighting. Never for any reason should brothers fight each other. If someone hits you, you may hit them back to defend yourself, but you never hit your brother for any reason. Is that understood? Her eyes darted back and forth between their faces as she waited for them to answer her. Both boys nodded. Louis folded his arms across his chest. He started it. Susan sighed and shook her head at them. I don't care who starts it. If I see you two fighting again, I'll tie your hands together for an entire day so you won't be able to do anything without learning to work together. Albert nodded. Yes, ma'am. The second rule is always display good manners. Last night at supper you two acted like ravenous wolves who hadn't eaten in months. I know that wasn't the case. You know how to eat correctly, and from now on, you will. I don't care how hungry you are, you will eat with your mouths closed and you will say please and thank you at the table. Louis made a face. What happens if we don't? She hadn't thought of a consequence for that, so she sat and thought about it for a minute. You'll be limited to bread and water for the rest of the meal and your next meal. You'll get to eat whatever the rest of the family is eating as long as you've shown good manners at the previous meal. She thought that sounded like a fitting punishment for bad table manners. Albert's jaw dropped. There's no way Pa would let you do that. Your pa told me to teach you to act right. He told me I can do anything I want. She didn't add that he told her not to spank them. She didn't want them to know that wasn't something in her arsenal. The third rule is always obey the first time. If I tell you to get your brother a glass of water, I don't want to be asked why you have to do it, or why he's thirsty. I just want it done and done correctly. Do you understand? Albert sank into his chair as if he'd been slapped. What's the punishment for that one? I'll make you repeat the action 10 times. So if you don't get your brother water, or question why he needs it, you'll make 10 trips back and forth to the kitchen with glasses of water. She watched their faces as she told them the punishment. Louis put his head down onto the table. Are we ever going to get to have fun again? Susan laughed. All the time. You'll find following the rules makes life a lot more fun for you, because you won't be in constant trouble. She stood up. I'll be adding more rules as we go, but those are the 3 we're starting with. Go ahead and write your sentences. She walked toward the kitchen, expecting them to obey her automatically after their talk. I don't know how to spell those words, remember? Louis made a face at her. Susan nodded. She walked back to the table and handed him the paper she'd already written the sentence on for him. 40 times each. She slipped into the kitchen and found Sadie cooking a large pot of beans for lunch. Have they always been this way? Sadie grinned at Susan. They were good boys before their mother died, but having an endless stream of nannies here and no one to really take charge made them think they didn't have to follow rules at all. I'm glad you're taking charge the way you are. Why did the nannies leave? Susan was almost afraid to ask, but as their new mother, she needed to know. The last one left because the boys kept putting frogs in her bed. The one before that left because they threw eggs at her while she was playing with the twins outside. So it was for a lot of different things, but they all had very good reasons. She paused and looked at Susan. I think you're doing the right thing by punishing them right away. Susan fixed herself a glass of water from the pump in the kitchen and leaned against the work table. I just hope it works. Not being able to spank them takes away a lot of my power. She shook her head in disgust at the way her hands were tied. Just stay strong. They'll obey. Susan pushed the door open a crack to see if the boys were working. She can't make us write the sentences, you know. Albert's voice came through loud and clear. Are you sure? Louis asked. Positive. I mean, what's she going to do if we just get up and go outside? Susan walked into the dining room. How are the sentences coming along? Albert stood up. I've decided I'm not going to write them. Susan set her glass of water on the table and put her hands on Albert's shoulders, forcing him to sit. You will write them, or you won't play at all today. You're not my mom. You can't make me. I'm not your mom, but I am your stepmom and the only mother you'll ever have. You'll sit there and do the work, or you'll never play again. I guarantee I can stand over you all day if I have to. Louis looked at her stubborn face and knew she meant business. He bent his head and immediately started to write the sentences. He wrote quickly and carefully made each letter. Albert, on the other hand, sat and stared at her as if he was sure she would just let him go if he continued to refuse. He stood up and she pushed him right back down in the chair. Louis finished and went outside to play while she stood over Albert waiting for him. He still hadn't picked up his pencil to write a single word. Susan spoke very quietly. If you don't pick up your pencil and start writing by the time I count to 3, I'll double the sentences. And you will spend the rest of the day in your room once you're finished writing them. She took a deep breath. 1. She looked out the window and smiled as she saw Louis running along the edge of the fence line as if he was racing the brown mare on the other side of the fence. 2. Albert picked up his pencil and started writing. He did it grudgingly, glaring at her the entire time, but he wrote. Within 20 minutes, he was finished. Once he was done, she sat next to him at the table. I know you don't want to obey me. I know you think I'm the enemy, but I'm your father's wife, which makes me your new mother. I can be your best friend in the world, or you can make me your worst enemy. Either way, you'll act the way I want you to act. I will not give in. Your behavior will improve if it kills both of us. She stood and picked up her water glass, walking back into the kitchen. Have fun outside, Albert. She was leaning against the counter in the kitchen when she heard the door slam. Her eyes met Sadie's and Sadie began to laugh. This is going to be fun to watch. Asterisk. Saturday was Mrs. Hackenschleimer's day off, and Susan braced herself for the onslaught when she woke up. She helped the twins eat their breakfast, and then went outside with all 4 boys to watch them as they played. She took some mending with her so she could sit in the shade of a tall oak tree while watching them. It wasn't long before she started to hear squeals from the pig's pen. As she rounded the corner, she saw that all 4 boys were in with the pigs chasing a small piglet who was running from them and squealing loudly. The twins were covered in mud. She could see it oozing out of their diapers as they ran. The 2 older boys had mud all over their faces and in their hair. Instead of going over to stop them immediately, she instead headed for the well and pulled up a bucket of ice-cold water. She carried the water over to the pig pen, but the boys were so involved with chasing the pig, they didn't notice her. She took careful aim, and threw the entire bucket of freezing water at Albert and Louis, knowing they were the ringleaders and the twins were just following suit. The boys sputtered and screamed. Albert glared at her. Why did you do that? Susan studied the belligerent boy for a moment before saying, well, since you were in the pig pen getting filthy, I knew you must want to take a bath, so I thought I'd help you out. She set the bucket on the ground and then lifted Thomas and Walter over the fence and led them into the house. You boys go ahead and keep splashing in the mud. Once I have the twins bathed, I'll come for you and get you washed as well. You can't give me a bath. I don't want you seeing my privates. Albert yelled after her. Susan shrugged, still walking away. You'd better be clean before I'm done with your little brothers then. She didn't care how much it upset Albert. He'd either clean himself with the water from the well, or he'd take a bath with her there. It was his choice. She took both little boys into the bathroom and stripped them down to their birthday suits. Even their little stomachs were completely covered with mud. She ran water into the bathtub for the first time and put them both in. She knelt by the side of the tub, washing their little bodies tenderly, talking to them the whole time. Your big brothers are going to get you into trouble if you keep listening to everything they tell you to do. What were you trying to do anyway? Give Piggy bath, Walter told her. Why would you want to give the piggy a bath? Piggies like to be dirty. Susan was sure one of the older boys had told them to do it, but she wanted to hear them say it. Bert said Piggy needed bath, Thomas said. I see. It was Albert's idea? Did he tell you to help? Had he deliberately coerced his 2-year-old brothers into the pig pen, or had it been their idea? Walter gave her a very serious look. Bert said we could play if we caught Piggy. Of course he did. Let me give you 2 a little piece of advice. Your brother Albert is trying to get you 2 in trouble. She soaked up their hair and washed them down. You need to stop listening to him. She lifted first Walter and then Thomas from the tub. She rubbed them both dry and led them up the stairs totally naked to their bedroom. She put clean diapers and shirts on them, but no pants. It was too hot for them to wear pants anyway. Taking them back downstairs, she went into the kitchen to Sadie. Can you feed these 2 while I chase down the other 2 and show them who's boss? Sadie nodded, taking Walter and putting him in one of the high chairs they kept in the kitchen. Susan lifted Thomas into the other chair. Wish me luck. Sadie grinned. Good luck. I wish I could see this one. Susan went to the bathroom and refilled the bathtub before she left the house and walked back toward the pig pen. It only held pigs, and she noted the piglet the boys had been chasing was still there. She looked around for the older boys. Finally, she spotted Albert as dirty as ever, leaning against the corral. She walked slowly, hoping to have the element of surprise on her side. She grabbed Albert's arm just as Louis spotted her. "Louis, follow me." She half-dragged Albert into the house, leading both boys into the bathroom. "Louis, get undressed and into the water." "Albert? You do the same." Albert folded his arms across his chest and shook his head. He made it very clear he wasn't about to get undressed in front of his stepmother. She started counting very slowly. When she reached 3, Louis was sitting in the tub washing himself, but Albert was still glaring at her. She reached out and unbuttoned his shirt with him kicking and screaming and wiggling to get away from her. "Stop it. You can't take my clothes off. You're a girl. Take them off yourself then. You're getting in that bathtub, and you're getting in there now." She folded her arms across her chest to give him a chance to do it himself. 1. She looked down at Louis, who was staring slack-jawed at her battle with his older brother. 2. Albert unbuttoned his pants and stepped out of them, turning his back to her before removing his drawers and jumping into the tub with his brother. He kept his hands covering his penis as he looked up at her and glared. "Get clean. You have 10 minutes, and I'll be standing outside the bathroom the entire time." She left the bathroom, but stayed close enough she would be able to hear whatever they were doing. She did give them privacy, though. David came into the house and saw her standing in the hallway outside the bathroom. "What are you doing?" he asked as he dipped his head and gave her a quick kiss. "Having another battle of wills with our eldest son." She looked at him to see how he'd react to the situation. "Who's winning?" "The same person who will always win." "Me?" David bit back a laugh. "What's this one about?" Albert convinced the others that catching a piglet and giving him a bath was a good idea. "By the time I heard the pigs squealing, the twins had mud oozing out of their diapers and the only things you could see of their faces were their eyes and mouths. I told Albert I'd bathe the twins and come back for him and Louis." She briefly explained how she'd caught Albert as he was leaning against the corral and forced him to undress. Her eyes were twinkling as she said, "He really didn't want me to see his privates." Thought. "I'm sure he didn't." He pointed to the bathroom door. "He's in there now?" He and Louis are bathing together. They have 5 minutes left. She raised her voice as she said the last 3 words. They'd better have their hair washed before they come out as well. David heard splashing coming from the bathroom to let him know they'd heard and were obeying. He caught Susan's hand and pulled her down the hall. "I know Albert's giving you fits, but he hasn't obeyed anyone this well since his mother died." He leaned down and kissed her again. "Thank you for getting the boys under control." She sighed. "The twins are fine. They do what I tell them to do. Louis is afraid of me, so there's no problem there. Albert, though? He thinks I'm going to give up and let him do what he wants if he fights me long and hard enough. It's not going to happen. If I give in now, I'll never be the supreme ruler of this house, and if I'm not the ruler here, then he will be. And that's not happening. He comes to me with complaints about you several times per day. He keeps telling me I should have married someone nice who wouldn't have bossed him around all the time. And?" She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at him to let him know he'd better take her side. "I tell him you're his mother and he's going to obey you. How would he dare do anything else? His little wife was fierce, and he wasn't willing to fight her about the boys. He promised her she could do what she wanted as regards their discipline as long as she didn't hit them. She hadn't hit them, but she'd sure made a difference in his household in only 2 short days. Good. The boys don't have it in their heads yet that they need to obey me without question. Well, that's not true. Albert's the only one who is really still giving me any trouble." She sighed. That boy thinks he can out-stubborn me, but he'll know better soon. David couldn't help but grin. I'm sure he will. I need to go check on them. She wandered down the hall to outside the bathroom door. I'm opening this door in 1 minute. Cover up with towels if you need to. David leaned against the wall and watched to see how she handled things. She waited a full minute and then called out, I'm coming in. Albert screamed as she opened the door. I'm not covered up. Susan shrugged. You had plenty of warning. Cover up next time. Both of you need to get upstairs and get clothes on before lunch. If you can stay clean for the rest of the day, I won't make you bathe before you go to bed tonight. You have to be clean for church tomorrow, though. She held the door wide open so the boys could leave when they were ready. Albert grabbed a towel and wrapped it around his waist, glaring at Susan, before running from the bathroom and up the stairs. Louis stood drying off just looking at her. He didn't have a problem with her seeing him naked. I'll try to stay clean, Ma. He followed his brother up the stairs to dress. Susan turned to David, who was still watching the show. Well, that was fun. You ready for lunch? David walked over to where Susan was standing and pulled her to him, hugging her tightly. You are priceless. Susan had no idea what he was talking about, but hugged him back. I'm hungry. What do you think Sadie made for lunch? Let's go find out. Asterisk. That night in bed, she snuggled against his side. You know, when Mrs. Hackenschleimer isn't working, you really should try to be at home. The boys need your influence. She'd thought all day about how to have this conversation with him and had decided to just blurt it out. I'm around on Sundays. You only have 1 day with them alone. They need you more than that. You come into the house late in the evenings and are gone Saturdays as well. It's not that I can't handle them. I think I've proven I can. They just need you more than that. She firmly believed that boys needed their father's influence as much as possible, just as girls needed their mothers. He thought about what she was saying for a moment. The truth was, he could easily spend more time with them. He simply chose not to because they were so difficult. I'll try. She nodded, her eyes closing sleepily. That's all I can ask. Chapter 7. Susan woke early on Sunday morning to make sure she could get the boys ready for church on time. Sadie took Sundays off, which left Susan in charge of seeing to breakfast. She was in the kitchen as soon as the sun was up, making French toast and bacon for her new family. She was uncertain how much everyone would eat, so she had a small mountain of food waiting when everyone came down to breakfast. Susan had Albert pour the milk, and was thrilled to see he followed her instructions immediately. Of course, that was one of the rules she'd made with consequences her first full day there, and he had yet to disobey those rules. Once breakfast was finished, she sent the older boys upstairs to get dressed for church while she went back into the kitchen. She wanted to go on a picnic after church, so she had fried some chicken while making breakfast. She'd boiled potatoes and eggs for a potato salad, and put it together before going upstairs to get the twins dressed for church. She noticed the boys had only matching outfits, and she wondered if that was a good thing. She decided she'd make them some clothes that were distinct for each of them the first chance she got. Once the twins were dressed, she sent them to their pa while she got dressed for church herself. She put her dark green dress on, and did her best to imitate the hairstyle Mrs. Duckworth had used for her wedding day. When she looked in the mirror above her dresser, she realized it wasn't perfect, but it was better than her usual style, which was just pulling all her hair back into a bun. She descended the stairs to find all of the boys with her husband waiting in the formal parlor. They were all dressed in their Sunday best and looked good, although Albert's tie was crooked. She walked to him and straightened his tie, but he knocked her hands away. She raised an eyebrow, looking down at him. I'm trying to help you and you will allow me to do it. She spent twice as long as needed straightening his tie, just to show him she could. Susan walked into the kitchen to get the picnic basket she'd packed along with the quilt she'd put with it. She handed it to David to carry out to the buggy. "We're going on a picnic after church," she announced. Albert groaned. "I don't want to go on a picnic." She stared at him. An 8-year-old boy who doesn't like picnics? "Do you really not want to go on a picnic, or do you not want to go because it was my idea?" Albert looked down, giving her the answer. Louis ran to her and hugged her. "I like picnics, Ma." Susan smiled, ruffling his hair. "I'm glad. I like to go on picnics a lot." She looked at David. "Are we all ready?" She knew she'd taken longer than anyone else to get ready for church, but she'd also had the most to do. "I think so. If no one else needs their ties straightened." David winked at her as he asked the question, letting her know he knew she'd spent more time straightening Albert's tie than she really needed to. She grinned at him and said, "I think the rest of your ties are good." She led the way outside and saw the team had already been hitched to the buggy. David stowed the basket in the back and then helped her up. He handed her Walter and Thomas. She put Walter in the middle and held Thomas in her lap while the older 2 boys scrambled into the back. "Where's a good place for a picnic around here?" she asked David as he pulled out of the driveway and headed south. She'd expected him to head north toward Fort Worth, so she looked at him in surprise. "Where are we going?" "There's a small country church about a mile down the road, so we go there instead of making the trek into Fort Worth. Most of our neighbors are members there as well, so it's just easier. As for where to go for a picnic, a lot of the members of our church have picnics right there on the lawn after the service. It's a way for people to fellowship without anyone having to go to the trouble of planning a party. Most Sundays there will be a group there unless it's one of the few Sundays where it's too cold or rainy. Would you like to join them, or would you rather go somewhere with just the family?" Susan asked. She wasn't sure which she preferred for herself, but she knew it would be good for the boys to have other children to play with. He shrugged. "If you don't mind, I'd rather go ahead and join the crowd. It'll be nice to introduce you around. It's a small church, and you've met several of the women already, but the sooner you meet the others, the sooner you'll feel a part of the community." "That sounds good. I assume there will be other children for the boys to play with there." She liked the idea of having a picnic with the church. She did want to meet the other women and make some more friends. Being without her family, no matter how much they annoyed her, in another state made her feel lonely for home. He didn't add that several of the families at church didn't let their children play with his boys. Hopefully that ban would be lifted as the boys learned how to behave. On the way to church, Susan explained to the boys how she wanted them to behave while they were there. "I expect both of you to be on your best behavior. You need to act the way you acted the first night you met me. Before and after the service, I want to be able to reach out and touch either one of you. In other words, no running off with friends until I see how you behave. The better you do, the more freedom I'll give you next week." The small country church was similar in looks to the one she'd attended back home. It was a wood building with a tall steeple that had been painted white. She felt right at home as she saw the building and was pleased with it. Someone obviously spent a lot of time seeing to the church property. The lawn was well manicured, and there were several different flowers thriving along the front of the church. With the drought they were in, someone must be watering them often. They left the picnic basket in the buggy as they walked into the church. She and David each held the hand of one of the twins, and Susan kept her eyes on the older boys. They listened to what she'd said and stayed right beside her and David the entire time he was introducing her around. The whole congregation only consisted of around 30 people, so there weren't a lot of people she needed to meet. She was pleased with how friendly everyone seemed. When the preacher got up to start services, she followed David to a pew and they sat with Albert next to her, the twins between them and Louis on the other side of David. During the first song, she noticed Albert fidgeting and wiggling and not singing. He acted just as her younger brothers had during church service. She hoped the preacher wasn't long-winded, because the boys just didn't have the attention spans for a long service. The preacher talked about honoring parents that day, and she found herself nudging Albert to pay attention when the preacher talked about obedience. He glared at her, but seemed to at least be listening at some points. At the end of the service they once again stood to sing, and she leaned over and whispered, "How did you manage to keep these four from running up and down the aisles when it was just you?" He grinned at her. "It wasn't easy, and I never said they didn't run up and down the aisles during service." She cringed at the mental image that came to her. She hoped he was kidding, but had a very strong suspicion he wasn't. No wonder the boys had such a bad reputation with the other parents. After the song, everyone trooped outside. David went to the buggy to get their quilt and picnic basket, and Susan spread the quilt on the ground near the church building. Once everyone was seated on the ground, she fixed plates for them all. David said a prayer for their family and they ate in the sunshine. After lunch, a baseball game was started. Susan watched as the older boys ran off to play. "Are you not going to join in?" she asked David. She noticed that a lot of the other men were playing while the women cheered them on. David seemed as if he would enjoy a game of baseball, so she was genuinely surprised when he didn't jump up to join the game. He shook his head. "I thought I'd spend some time with my wife." She smiled. The twins were sprawled on the quilt, each of them sleeping. She was surprised they were able to fall asleep in the confusion of the day, but realized they were exhausted from their busy day. It seems strange to sit here at a picnic and be the mom instead of just the oldest sister. She'd shared a lot of her mother's duties growing up, and had thought she would feel nothing different when she became a mother to the young boys, but she'd been wrong. The feelings of responsibility were slightly overwhelming for her. He looked at her. "That's right. You have 11 younger brothers and sisters. What was that like?" "Chaotic." It was the first word to pop into her head, so of course it was the first word that came out of her mouth. Nothing had ever seemed to go right at home, and she'd always blamed her mother for it. It never occurred to her the sheer number of children could have anything to do with the overwhelming chaos. "What does that mean?" he asked with one raised eyebrow. She shrugged. "We never really had any money growing up, so I had to quit school after 8th grade. I watched neighbor kids for extra money, which I gave to my parents to help out with the family expenses. When I wasn't working for someone else, I was watching my younger siblings, or cooking, or cleaning, or sewing. From the time I was 6 or 7 when I wasn't in school, I was watching the little ones." She stroked Walter's hair as he slept quietly on the quilt. "My childhood wasn't terrible, don't get me wrong. I just had a lot of responsibilities. My parents were really strict with me and my 3 siblings who were after me in age. After the 4 of us, Ma just kind of gave up. She said she was too tired to keep fighting. So the 8 youngest kids are monsters." He smiled at her. "They can't be that bad. Our congregation referred to them as the demon horde. The reason I decided to answer your brother's ad was I got home from working all day and found out my younger siblings had tipped over the outhouse while my sister was in it and painted the cow purple. They did all that after having an egg fight in the kitchen and hitting her in the side of the head with an egg." She couldn't help but grin at the memory. She still had egg shell in her hair. "Purple?" The laughter was apparent on David's face, but he held it in for her sake. "Purple. Go ahead and laugh. I know it's funny. I was just so tired of being a surrogate parent to my brothers and sisters, I decided to get married." She traced the pattern on the quilt they were sitting on. "I told anyone who would listen that if God ever cursed me with children, I'd parent with a very long switch." Her eyes met his as she wondered how he'd react to her mentioning a switch. He cringed. "You certainly weren't looking for a family like mine then, were you?" She laughed. "Not at all. The twins are one thing. When you mentioned having 2-year-olds, I knew they were young enough that I could raise them any way I saw fit. The older 2 are more than I'd bargained for." She watched as Louis chased the ball across the church lawn. Of course, Louis is already straightening up and doing what he's told. Albert and I have a lot more battles of wills ahead of us, I'm afraid. He took her hand in his. I'm glad you took a chance on us. I'll help with Albert any way I can. This is going to sound silly, but I feel kind of guilty for marrying you when I came out here to marry your brother. It's as if I'm cheating on him somehow. She shrugged to indicate she didn't understand the feelings, but she couldn't deny them. A look of sadness came over his face at her words. It doesn't sound silly at all. I know just how you feel. Jesse died a good 2 weeks before you came here, and I debated with myself every day and finally decided to ask you to marry me the day you arrived. I didn't feel like I should ask you, out of respect for him, but you'd never really met. David stared off into space for a moment. I'm glad we're married and we really filled a need in each other's lives. You didn't have to go back to the demon horde, and I got the wife I needed, but I wish we'd met under any other circumstances. She nodded. So do I. What was he like? I mean, I read his letters, but there were only 2, and they were bare bones. What was he like as a brother? She hated how little she knew about the man she had planned to marry. With every day that passed, she thought less about him and more about the man she had married. Was she doing something wrong by not thinking of him more? Was it disloyal to his memory when she really hadn't ever known him? David smiled reminiscently. There was only 3 years difference in our ages, and we grew up pretty close. I always wanted to run off and get into trouble, and he was always the voice of reason. He tried to talk me out of so many of the things I did when I was a kid. Like what? She wondered if she really wanted to know what type of trouble he'd gotten into as a child, but she'd learned at their wedding lunch, the boys came by their mischief-making tendencies naturally. He thought hard to come up with a good story. Well, when I was about 13, I had this mean teacher. She was the type who took you back to the cloakroom every day and beat your bottom with a big paddle. I'd been beaten 3 times that day already, so I wasn't exactly pleased with her. Anyway, at the end of lunch recess, just before she called us back, she always spent a couple of minutes in the outhouse. So, at the beginning of lunch that day, I asked all the other boys for their suspenders and tied them together, and then hid the long rope I'd made out of them in the bushes. When she went into the outhouse, I tied her in there. Charles helped me. He grinned at the memory. Of course, Jesse was trying to talk me out of it the entire time. I think that's how Miss Schroeder knew it was Charles and me. We got our butts whipped for that one, and we were suspended from school for 3 weeks. Jessie was suspended too. I thought Ma was going to break her own rule and beat me for sure, but she didn't. What did she do? She wasn't sure if she'd be able to follow his rule and not use a switch on the boys if they did something that bad. He shrugged. Told me to go talk to my father. What did he do? She closed her eyes as she waited for the response. Please tell me his pa at least told him it was a bad thing to do and he should never do anything like that again? He kind of patted me on the head and said, boys will be boys. Then he let me help him break a new mare he'd just gotten. Loved that horse. She's the dam of most of the horses we have on the ranch today. David grinned reminiscently as he finished the story. Sounds to me like you were rewarded for your bad behavior. No wonder he doesn't have a big problem with most of the things his sons do. His father was even worse. Well, I guess you could look at it that way. David shrugged as if he didn't really care to think about it too much. No wonder the boys are so out of control. What kind of parent was Caroline? Please tell me she was strict with them, and they've had some discipline in their lives. Otherwise, my job is going to be so much harder than it would be. He watched Louis miss the ball as he tried to bat. Not as strict as you are, but she had the boys under control. Of course, Albert was only 6 when she died, and Louis was only 4. I don't know how she would have been with the boys at the age they are now. You must really miss her. She wondered then if she'd ever live up to his previous wife, but decided not to let it bother her. Caroline had given him 4 children and years of her life. He'd known her for less than a week. Sometimes I miss her. She's been gone for over 2 years, though, and the mourning period is certainly over. He stretched his legs out in front of him. She was a good wife to me, and I'm sorry she died, but it's time for me to move on. Even if Jessie hadn't died, I'd have sent off for a mail-order bride of my own. What exactly happened with Jessie? She hadn't asked before, because even though she was curious about the exact details, it obviously hurt him to talk about it. Jessie came to my house for dinner on the 20th of July. He was talking about you and how you were going to come out here and marry him. He talked about his plans to buy a ranch in the area. I offered to give him half my ranch, which I've done a dozen times in the past. He refused, saying the spread shouldn't be split, which he always did. Really, the ranch is huge and I wanted to split it with him when Pa died, but he said it needed to be kept together for my boys to inherit. The look of sadness in his eyes made her want to reach out and hug him. Jessie told me he had to go to the acre to investigate a murder, and I told him to make sure someone went with him or to go during the day. He took a deep breath. Jessie had never gone to the acre at night, but he'd had to go during the day several times to report on different things. He didn't listen to me. Jessie always thought he was invincible. Anyway, he wasn't the object of the gunfire, but he got in the middle of a shootout, and a stray bullet pierced his heart. He died right away. I'm so sorry. She reached out her hand and squeezed his. She knew that even though he'd benefited in a way from his brother's death, he would have given anything to still have a brother. David nodded. So am I. He was my best friend as well as being my brother. I feel like it's my fault, because he wanted me to go to the acre with him that night, but another nanny had just quit on me, and I couldn't leave the boys. Why did the nanny quit? She was certain there had to be a reason. The boys probably gave her plenty of reasons to quit. David grinned sheepishly. She got tired of the boys putting frogs in her bed. Susan closed her eyes. Frogs? Susan silently vowed to start looking under the covers before she got into bed at night. She wasn't afraid of frogs, but certainly didn't enjoy their slimy feel against her skin. Frogs. My brothers did that to me until I put a snake in their beds. They never did it again. She shrugged as if she didn't understand why they'd stopped, and gave him her best innocent look. David laughed. I know you don't see it, but you are the perfect mother for my boys. You don't take any of their nonsense and you give as good as you get. I'm not sure that's such a good thing. Her brothers had loved calling her a tomboy and saying she wasn't girly enough to find a husband. With my boys it is. You have to be strong enough to fight back, or they'll run all over you. Why did I marry you again? You couldn't resist my good looks and charming personality. She rolled her eyes. That must be it. Susan moved closer to David and rested her head against his shoulder. She'd gotten up earlier than usual and was getting tired. The heat of Texas was draining for her as well. She'd never felt heat like that. She was thankful they'd found a spot in the shade for their picnic. You tired? Exhausted. She was fighting to keep her eyes open. Stretch out and go to sleep. There's nothing you need to do right now. It's the perfect opportunity. She shook her head. I haven't napped since I was a small child. How could she nap on the church lawn with a baseball game going on just a few feet away? Sounds like you've had no time to nap. You do now. What about the boys? Her eyes drifted back to the game both of the older boys were currently engaged in. I'm here. I can watch them while you sleep. Are you sure? She'd never been so tempted to take a nap in her life. Absolutely. He urged her to put her head in his lap and stretch out. The boys were on either side of her. She was asleep in minutes, and he sat staring down at her, amazed at how young she looked in her sleep. He knew she was only 18, but with the boys, she acted as if she'd been in charge of children forever. Of course, with her upbringing she'd been in charge of children since she was a child herself. He only hoped she'd continue on as she'd started. His boys were a handful, and he was grateful that she was doing so much with them, but more than anything, he was thrilled she was his wife. He needed her as much as, if not more than, the boys had. The years since Caroline had died had been extremely lonely. Susan was bringing everything back into focus for him, and he felt like there was now something to wake up for every morning. That evening the boys all went to bed right after they finished dinner at Susan's insistence. Even Albert only gave a token protest. They were all exhausted after spending a long day outside playing hard. Susan sat in the family parlor with David reading. It was the first chance she'd had to just sit and relax since she'd been there other than the picnic. She'd done a lot of reading on the train, but she felt as if she spent her whole life looking for ways to sneak off and read on her own. On her way to bed she stopped to peek in on the boys. She was amazed how young Albert and Louis looked as they slept. She dropped a kiss on each of their cheeks as she pulled the sheets more snugly around them. When she was finished she turned and saw David watching her. She shrugged and walked to the twins' room. They look like angels when they're asleep. If only they acted like them when they were awake, he muttered under his breath. They wouldn't be boys if they did. She tucked the sheets around the twins before tiptoeing out of their room. Are you glad Mrs. Hackenschleimer's weekend off is over? She laughed softly. I'm ready for her to be back. I can't focus on the older boys as much as I need to when she's not here with the twins. She didn't think she'd need a nanny forever, though. Yes, it was nice, but once the boys were under control, she wouldn't have nearly enough to do. They went to their room together and she undressed for bed. She was surprised she'd lost her self-consciousness around him so quickly, but she wasn't complaining. Being embarrassed around him every night wasn't something she wanted. She slipped between the sheets and lay on her side watching him undress. They hadn't made love since their wedding night, because he'd said she needed time to heal. She wondered if he'd try to start something that night. She hadn't seen him naked the one time they'd been together, so she watched with interest. He obviously didn't feel modest as he dropped his pants and underwear to the floor. When he was standing naked beside the bed, he caught her stare and raised an eyebrow. Get an eyeful? I did. I didn't see you the other night when we consummated. Growing up on a farm you'd have thought she'd have seen an adult male nude at least once in her life, but she hadn't. And she certainly hadn't seen an aroused adult male, which was what she was looking at then. And she had the grace to blush. I like what I see, she told him honestly. He walked around to his side of the bed and pulled her into his arms. Does this mean you're feeling ready to resume that part of our marriage? I'm not sore anymore if that's what you're asking. He pressed a kiss to her lips and stroked a hand down her side. Are you sure? She nodded. I'm positive. I feel good as new. He slowly moved his hand around to her breast and over her hip. He kept his movements slow and steady to try to ease her into the newness of lovemaking. After a moment, she pushed against his shoulders until she'd reversed their positions, and he was on his back. You take things so slow. She kissed him the way he'd taught her, her tongue entering his mouth to tangle with his. Her hands were all over him, stroking him from shoulder to thigh and back again. She wondered for a moment if he'd mind if she touched him there, but decided she didn't care if he minded. She was curious, and she was going to touch him anywhere she wanted. Anything he'd done to her was fair game as far as she was concerned. Her hand moved down over his belly until she found the part of him she was looking for, wrapping her hand around it, and feeling it grow between her fingers. When he groaned, she jerked her hand away, her eyes going to his face by the light of the full moon shining through their open bedroom window. He caught her hand and brought it back to him, whispering, "No, don't stop." She spent a moment stroking him and learning the feel of him, before she rolled to her back again, grasping his shoulder to pull him along with her. I'm not fragile. I won't break. He grinned as he followed her down, his hands squeezing her breasts and learning their feel. He was thrilled she was taking such an active part in their lovemaking, and rolled on top of her, spreading her legs with his thigh. When he entered her this time, she felt only pleasure. None of the pain from the previous time was there. Once he was fully inside her, he paused for a moment, looking down into her eyes in the pale light. "Are you okay?" "I was until you stopped." She heard his chuckle as she wrapped her legs around his waist, moving her hips with his to urge him to go faster. She felt the same pressure building inside her as she had on her wedding night, but this time it didn't stop. It kept going until she thought she would break, and then it happened. She felt like her world burst into a million pieces. She bit into his shoulder to keep from shouting and waking the boys. He groaned as he found his satisfaction and collapsed on top of her. "Are you okay?" he whispered. She laughed. "I'm more than okay. Can we do that every night?" She was out of breath and eager all at once. He grinned, brushing a kiss across her neck. "Sounds good to me." He rolled off her and pulled her into his arms. "If we wake up before the boys, we can do it every morning, too." Going to sleep right now." She felt like she belonged somewhere for the first time since she'd come to Texas. In his arms was where she should be. Chapter 8. After breakfast the following morning, Susan sat down with just Albert at the table. She'd let him slide on the absolute obedience rule as he'd gotten used to her, and she couldn't let that happen any longer. Albert sat back in his chair and glared at her, letting her know he didn't appreciate her presence in his house or her insistence they have another little talk. Susan cleared her throat before speaking. "I want you to know I've noticed you're not being obedient the first time I tell you to do things. I've been here for long enough now that you know you need to obey. I will start using consequences if you don't obey immediately the first time I tell you to do something. It doesn't matter whether or not you like me. I'm your mother now and I'm here to stay. You don't really expect me to do whatever you tell me to do you? I mean, you're not my real mom. You're just some girl my dad married." Susan took a deep breath, mentally counting to 10 before responding. "I'm the only mom you've got, and yes, I expect absolute obedience every time I say something. From now on, there will be consequences, and they will be swift. Is that understood? You can't make me do anything I don't want to do. I don't care what you say." He stood up quickly, tipping his chair over in the process. "Pick your chair up." There was no time like the present to assert her authority and make sure he knew he was going to obey. "No. You can't make me." He ran from the room and straight out the front door to the corral where he knew his father was spending the day working with the horses. Susan left the chair on its side and warned both Sadie and Mrs. Hackenschleimer not to fix it before she followed at a more sedate pace. She'd give Albert time to complain to David about her and tell her what a terrible stepmother she was before she made him do exactly what he'd been told to do. Asterisk. David looked up to see Albert running toward him, his face red with anger and his fists clenched. He probably had another run-in with Susan. When is he going to understand that she's not going to give up, and he's going to obey her or suffer her consequences? "I hate her, Pa. She's so mean to me. Why did you marry her?" Albert had angry tears running down his face and his voice was shaking. "She's mean to you? What has she done that's mean?" David's voice was calm. He wanted the boy to explain what Susan had done that was so terrible. He was certain she hadn't been mean in any real way, but she did tend to threaten to use a switch on the boys more than he would like. Albert took a deep breath, winded from his run from the house. "She said I have to do whatever she says whenever she says it. If I don't, she's going to punish me. She's your mother now. She has the right to expect obedience from you." David's voice was matter-of-fact, trying to let his son know he would back up Susan if necessary. "But she doesn't have the right to punish me." "What kind of punishment are we talking about?" She doesn't have the right to spank you, but she has the right to do anything else necessary to get you to obey. David folded his arms over his chest to see what Albert would say about that. She said if I don't obey the first time, I have to do what she told me to do 10 times. That's just stupid. Whether you think it's stupid or not, it's your job to do exactly what she says. Did she tell you to do something you didn't do? Albert kicked at a clump of dirt on the ground, not meeting his father's eyes. Well, I knocked over my chair by mistake, and she told me to pick it up, but I ran out here to you instead. David sighed. Why didn't you just pick it up? Wouldn't that have made more sense? Especially if you knew you'd have to pick it up 10 times instead of 1 if you didn't? I just don't understand why I have to listen to her. She doesn't want me to have any fun anymore. She doesn't? Didn't she let you have fun yesterday? Didn't she even encourage you to have fun by fixing a picnic lunch? And she certainly didn't stop you from joining the baseball game. Albert shrugged. I guess. I think she does want you to have fun. She just wants you to have fun in a way that doesn't hurt others. She wants you to be well behaved in your fun. He knew at Albert's age, he'd have fought Susan's influence as hard as Albert was, but he needed his son to see she was there to help, not hurt. I like things the way they were before she came here. Can't you send her back to Massachusetts? David grinned despite all his efforts not to. No, I can't. I married her. You heard the judge. He said, till death do you part. That means I'll be married to her until one of us dies. And if I kill her, I'll just have to go to prison and never see you again, he added quickly before Albert suggested it. Well, I don't want you to go to prison. Good. Because even for you, I wouldn't kill my wife. I happen to like having her around. He saw Susan walking toward them. Squeezing Albert's shoulder, he said, it's time for you to face the music, son. Albert looked toward the house. I guess she's the music. David chuckled. She is right now. Well, she's definitely not a tune I like. When Susan reached them, she held her hand out for Albert's. Are you ready for your punishment? Albert looked down at his feet. I guess so, but do I have to hold your hand on the way back to the house? Susan nodded solemnly. It's part of the punishment. You have to talk to me, too. She knew Albert would rather do anything than hold her hand, so she made a big deal about holding hands with him, swinging their hands back and forth. David met her eyes and winked at her as he watched them walk back toward the house. He realized a little more every day just how incredible the woman he'd married was. Susan waited until they were out of earshot of David before saying, you know you broke the rule we were talking about during our conversation about it. Her voice portrayed just how silly she thought that was. Albert sighed and kicked at a weed in his path. I know. You know I'm going to punish you for it, right? Yes, ma'am. Do you remember the punishment for disobedience? As if he could forget the punishment when they'd just been talking about it. I have to do whatever I was told to do 10 times. His shoulders sagged as he said it. So I get to knock over a chair 9 times and pick it up 10? Susan shook her head. No, knocking over the chair is fun, so I get to do that part. You just have to pick it up 10 times, and set it right at the table. She did her best not to smile as she told him, because she didn't want him to think she was laughing at his punishment. You do know that's stupid, right? I tried to talk your pa into letting me take a switch to your bottom instead, but he said I couldn't. So I have to get creative with the stupid punishments. She grinned down at his bowed head. Would you rather I used a switch? That doesn't sound as stupid as picking up a chair 10 times. She laughed. It doesn't sound as stupid to me either, but your pa feels differently. She opened the door and waited while he preceded her into the house. He walked straight to the dining room and picked up the chair he'd knocked over. 1, he said with a groan. She bit her lip to keep from laughing as she knocked it over. He picked it up. 2. After he reached 10, she told him to go into his room for an hour and think about how things could be calmer around the house. After he'd stomped off to his room, she looked up and saw her audience. Sadie, Mrs. Hackenschleimer, Louis, and the twins had all been watching. She shrugged at the older women. Well, that was fun. The sarcasm in her voice told the older women she thought it was anything but fun. Mrs. Hackenschleimer shook her head. That boy needs his bottom beaten. I don't think we're going to be able to convince David of that, Susan said with a sigh. Don't worry, though. It's all a game, and it's a game I'm going to win. Children in large families tend to be competitive, and I come from one of the biggest. She went back to the family parlor to make clothes that weren't identical for the twins. Asterisk. During dinner that evening, David was amazed at the difference in his boys. They were all demonstrating the kind of table manners they'd had for Susan's first visit to their house. The twins were even eating with their spoons more and less with their fingers. His eyes met Susan's across the length of the long table. He gave her a slight smile, trying to communicate the difference he saw and how pleased he was about it without bringing it to the attention of the boys. He was truly amazed at how much better all of his boys were behaving after less than a week. He prayed it wasn't just the calm before the storm. So what did everyone do today? He asked. Albert sighed. I spent some time in my room thinking about my behavior, and then I found the perfect tree for the treehouse you said you'd help me build. When can we get started? David was surprised Albert even remembered the promise. It had happened before the twins were born, and Albert hadn't mentioned it since. David studied his oldest son. Did he truly understand how difficult life had been for him as a single parent, but now things would be easier because of Susan? It's going to be a while. I have 3 colts I'm training right now, and each one is needed as soon as possible. That means 10-hour days, 6 days a week for a while. Albert pushed his peas around on his plate, obviously annoyed by what his father had said. Susan had a thoughtful look on her face for a moment before saying, I could help you, Albert. I helped my younger brothers build a tree house when I was around your age. Albert stared at her in disbelief. But you're a girl. Susan hid her grin as she shrugged. I am. I'm also really good with a hammer and saw. She looked at David. How soon could you get us some lumber? I can request it tomorrow and we could have it by Wednesday. Would it be okay with you if your ma helped with it instead of me? He held his breath waiting for the answer. This would be such a good way for Susan and Albert to come to terms with one another. Albert seemed to think about it for a minute. She wouldn't be allowed in it after she was done, because she's a girl. Susan shook her head, looking very solemn. Oh, of course not. I would never dream of going in there when it was finished. I'll just help you build it and make sure it's safe. She looked at Louis, who was squirming in his chair with excitement. You'd help, too, wouldn't you, Louis? Yes. The single word was shouted in his excitement. David hid a chuckle as he watched his wife endear his boys to her. Walter looked down at Susan. Twee house. Susan nodded. Now you boys are too little to climb up in the treehouse, but when we're done with the treehouse, maybe our building team could build a fort for you. Fort? Thomas asked. Do you know what a fort is, Thomas? Thomas shook his head, his eyes wide with wonder. Susan directed her attention to both Thomas and Walter when she told them. It's a building for just the 2 of you to play in. No one else would be able to play in your special fort. We could keep blocks and trains in it for you. Twains? Walter asked. Susan nodded. Trains. Do you boys want a fort? Both Thomas and Walter nodded their heads before returning their attention to their dinner. Susan met David's eyes. That's settled then. If you'll get us some wood, the boys and I will start building the treehouse on Wednesday. Albert looked slightly disappointed that he'd be helped by Susan and not David, But he wasn't going to quibble because he wanted to have his treehouse as soon as he could. Will you, Pa? David nodded. I'll order it tomorrow. He could get one of the ranch hands to build it for them, but knew it would be a better experience for the boys, and for Susan, to build it themselves. He hoped this would make Albert feel less animosity toward his new stepmother. The excitement around the table was palpable. All 4 boys were glowing at the idea of building places to play, and Susan looked as if she was relieved she'd finally found a way to get through to Albert. Asterisk. After dinner, Susan put the little boys to bed, and when she came down the stairs she found David at the table with a pencil and paper and the boys ordering him to draw something. David's eyes met hers. They want me to help them design the treehouse, but I'm not good with drawing. Do you have any idea how to draw a treehouse? Susan had always been a decent artist. I can try. She took the paper and pencil from David, and sketched a tree with lots of leaves and several branches that would work for building a treehouse. Is this the kind of tree we have to work with? She had seen a similar tree not far from the house, but not all the way to the corral, and thought that might be the one Albert was talking about. Albert looked and nodded slowly. That's the tree. The one that's almost to the corral. I know which one you mean. I thought that might be it. She drew a few rectangles spaced about a foot apart along the trunk as footholds for the boys to use as they climbed to the treehouse. We'll pound these in first to make it easier for us to get up there. She drew a large flat base along the top of the lowest branches of the tree. Now, do you want walls, or should we just build several platforms to give you a several-story treehouse? Albert and Louis walked into the parlor and Susan and David could hear them whispering, but Susan couldn't make out what they were saying. Can we have both? Albert asked. Susan shrugged. Is that okay with you? She asked David. You're buying the lumber. Having walls would cost more, of course, but she didn't think David would quibble over extra boards. I don't see why not. It'll take longer to build, though. The 4 of them worked on planning out the treehouse until late into the night. By the time they went to sleep, Susan had a drawing of what the boys wanted for their treehouse, complete with curtains. Boy curtains, Louis insisted. No flowers. They're too girly. Are you sure you want to do this? David asked as he climbed into bed and pulled her into his arms. It's a big project to take on. Susan smiled. Some of my best memories of being Albert's age were the hours and hours my brothers and sister and I spent working on the treehouse. Of course, we didn't have an adult directing the project, and when it was done it looked like it had been built by someone who had over-imbibed in liquor, but we were so proud of it. My younger brothers and sisters still play in it. David smiled, trailing a finger down her bare stomach. Well, if you want to do it, I certainly won't complain. He kissed her cheek. I can't believe how much better the boys are already behaving. It's like the difference between night and day. I know. I've been happy with them. She traced her finger along his lips. I'm going to have to hurry if I want to get the twins' new outfits done tomorrow. He frowned. Why are you making the twins new outfits? I thought they had plenty of clothes. Oh, they do. I just think they should be able to dress in non-matching clothes if they'd like. I have younger brothers who are twins, and they hated being forced to match. As soon as they were old enough to speak in complete sentences, they insisted they be allowed to wear things that weren't identical. I think all twins should have a choice. People had often suggested she and Elizabeth should dress alike, and she'd hated the idea so much, she vowed she'd never do that to her children whether she had twins or not. They're only 2. But they're developing their own individual personalities. They don't need to think of themselves as 2 halves of a whole. They're each people in their own right. Coming from a small family, he wouldn't think about being lumped in with her siblings like she did. People would hear her last name was Miller and step back saying, one of the demon horde. The boys didn't need to be lumped together that way. He shrugged. I guess. If they want to continue to dress alike, they'll have plenty of clothes to be able to do that. I just think they should have a choice. She wanted him to see her point of view, but he seemed to have lost interest. Whatever you say, he whispered as his lips went to her neck. Remember you said that. No words were needed for a long time after that.